In a great kingdom, the king declared he would hear one voice from the common people. The news spread through the village, and every man wanted to be that one voice. A poor boy in torn clothes stood at the edge of the crowd and said nothing. That night he sat alone by candlelight and wrote what he had carried inside him. 3 days later, the village elder stepped forward to claim the right to speak. The poor boy raised his hand, and the crowd turned and looked at him and laughed. The royal herald studied the boy's face and then pointed at him and said, "This one." The laughter stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than the laughter. The boy walked through the palace gates alone and did not look back at the crowd. The throne room doors opened, and the boy saw the king sitting far above him. He took one slow breath and walked forward across the long stone floor. The king leaned forward and studied the boy with sharp and weary eyes. The head advisor whispered in the king's ear, but the king raised his hand. The king nodded once, and the room went completely silent, and the boy began. Every man in that throne room heard something they had not expected to hear. The boy spoke slowly, and every word he chose had been chosen very carefully. He did not speak about gold, and he did not speak about power or glory. He spoke about the village roads that broke every winter and were never fixed. He spoke about the farmers who paid taxes on crops that drought had already taken. He spoke about the old men who died waiting for help that never arrived. The king's expression moved from boredom to attention with every sentence. The head advisor shifted on his feet, and his narrow eyes showed the first unease. The boy paused and looked directly at the king, and the king did not look away. He said, "A kingdom is only as strong as the weakest man living inside it." The throne room was so quiet that the torches could be heard burning on the walls. The head advisor stepped forward and tried to interrupt with an outraged voice. The boy turned and looked at him calmly and then turned back to the king. He continued speaking as if the interruption had not happened at all. The king stood up from his throne, and the entire room froze completely still. He raised one hand and silenced the advisor with a single sharp look. The king stepped down from the throne and walked toward the poor boy slowly. He stood directly before the boy, and the boy looked up and kept speaking. The final words the boy spoke landed in the room like stones dropped in still water. The final words the boy spoke landed in the room like stones dropped in still water. The king stood very still after those words and did not speak for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at his head advisor with completely different eyes. The advisor bowed his head and could not meet the king's gaze and stepped back. The king asked the boy one quiet question, and the boy answered without hesitation. The king walked to his table and picked up a quill and began to write. He pressed his royal seal into the wax, and the sound of it filled the silence. He turned and handed the sealed document to the boy with both hands. He turned and handed the sealed document to the boy with both hands. The boy took it carefully and looked at it, and then looked up at the king. The king placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and spoke quietly to him alone. Every advisor and guard in the room bowed their heads without being told to. The head advisor was escorted out and did not look back as he left. The boy stood beside the king and looked out over the throne room in silence. He had walked in with nothing, and he stood now with something that could not be taken. Not gold and not a title, but the truth spoken aloud in the place it most needed to be. The king sat back on his throne, and for the first time in years, his eyes looked rested. The boy walked out of the palace as the sun was turning the stone walls gold. The crowd that had laughed at him 3 days ago stood now and watched him pass. He stopped at the ancient tree where he had sat alone writing his words that night. He placed his hand on the bark and stood there quietly for a long moment. He thought about all the people whose words had never reached the right ears. He thought about how close he had come to staying silent like everyone expected. And he understood that the most dangerous thing in a kingdom is a voice never used. The kingdom did not change in one day, and real change never moves that quickly. But something had shifted in the throne room that no advisor could shift back. A boy with bare feet and torn clothes had been given one chance to speak, and every word he said had changed something that needed to be changed for a long time. Because truth, spoken calmly in the right place at the right moment, changes everything.